The morning sun slid through the tall glass windows of the office building, casting long golden lines across the lobby floor. The place buzzed quietly, just the soft sounds of footsteps, muted voices, and the distant hum of elevators. It was one of those expensive buildings where everything felt polished, controlled, and a little too perfect. Maya walked through the lobby with a calm, steady pace. She carried a set of neatly organized folders pressed against her chest, her steps light and unhurried. People often overlooked her when she entered rooms like this. She wasn't flashy, she didn't push herself forward, and she never raised her voice. But that never bothered her. She knew who she was, and she knew why she was here. Today was supposed to be an important day. A major deal, one that would affect hundreds of workers and shift the direction of a whole development project, was finally coming together. She had spent months preparing the details, revising documents, calculating risks, and solving problems that no one else even noticed. It was the kind of work that didn't earn applause, but quietly held the entire project together. Inside the conference room on the 14th floor, the atmosphere felt different. The long table was spotless, the chairs arranged with military precision, and the city skyline stretched out behind the large windows. 3 executives were already seated, reviewing their notes and checking their watches. And then a voice echoed from the hallway, aloud, confident, and full of the kind of self-assurance that often comes from having too much money and too few people willing to challenge you. "All right, let's make this quick. I've got another meeting after this," the man announced as he approached. This man was the investor everyone had been talking about, a wealthy figure known for being sharp, strategic, and, depending on who you asked, difficult. His reputation came from years of negotiating hard, winning bigger, and listening less. He entered the room like he owned it, wearing an expensive suit, a heavy watch, and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked around the room, nodding at the executives. Then his gaze landed on Maya, who was quietly setting up documents at the table. "You," he said, pointing casually. "Do you mind getting me a coffee? Black, no sugar, and bring some water too. Cold, not room temperature." Maya looked up for a moment. She wasn't offended. She had seen this before. People made assumptions. They always did. She gave a small nod, not saying a word, and continued arranging the documents. "She's not one of the executives," started. But Maya subtly shook her head at him, signaling that it was fine. The executive fell silent. The rich man let out a short laugh. "Well, at least someone here listens." Then he tossed his folder onto the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down with a loud sigh. "Okay, let's get this rolling." The executives exchanged quick glances, unsure whether to correct him or move forward. Maya finished placing the documents and sat down quietly in her seat at the far end of the table. She didn't need to defend herself. She didn't need to prove anything, not yet. The meeting began with polite greetings. The executives explained the outline of the deal, the projected profits, the anticipated challenges, and the long-term benefits. The investor listened with half interest, glancing at his phone every few minutes. At one point, one of the executives said, "Maya will go over the land use details in a moment. She's more familiar with the technical aspects." The investor frowned slightly, confused. "Why would the assistant handle that part?" he asked without lowering his voice. Maya didn't react. She kept her eyes on the documents, letting the moment pass. She had learned long ago that reacting too quickly only fed people's assumptions. The executives tensed, clearly wanting to say something, but once again, Maya gave them a small, reassuring glance. The investor shrugged. "Whatever, as long as she doesn't slow us down." For the next 15 minutes, he talked nonstop. He explained how he wanted the deal to move faster, insisted that certain parts were unnecessary, and even joked about people in small roles trying to act important. Every time he said something dismissive, he looked straight at Maya, as if testing her. She stayed calm, her hands folded neatly on the table. But while the investors saw a quiet assistant, executives saw something entirely different. They watched her carefully. They noticed how she listened, how she tracked every detail in her mind, how she waited patiently for the right moment to speak. They had seen her handle tougher people than this man. They knew she didn't need to fight for respect. She earned it through her work. Still, Maya felt a small knot in her stomach, not from the insults, but from the knowledge that the next part of the meeting would determine everything. She had spent months preparing this project, and the deal needed to be airtight. There was no room for ego, no space for carelessness. If the investor didn't understand certain key parts, the whole project could fall apart. And yet here he was, too confident to listen, too impatient to understand. He tapped the table suddenly. "All right, assistant. Are you done organizing papers? Because we can't sit here all day waiting." One of the executives stiffened. "Sir," Maya gently placed her hand on the table, signaling him to stop. Then she looked at the investor with a calm, neutral expression. "I'm ready," she said softly. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Good. Let's hope you can keep up." Maya opened the folder in front of her. Her movements were smooth and steady, her face composed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She began with simple details, the kind even a rushed listener could follow. But as she spoke, something in the room began to shift. She explained the environmental limits that needed to be met. She described the zoning rules, the legal restrictions, and the financial risks the investor hadn't accounted for. Her words were clear and precise, each one backed by months of research and verification. She didn't use complicated language. She didn't show off. She simply explained the truth. The investor's smile slowly faded. Not completely, just enough for the executives to notice. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Wait," he interrupted. "Where did you get those numbers?" "From the latest county reports," Maya replied calmly. "They were updated 2 weeks ago. The older numbers you have are no longer valid." The investor blinked. He wasn't expecting that. "And you're sure?" "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze. "Very sure." Silence filled the room for a moment. The executives watched him closely, sensing the beginning of a shift. He cleared his throat. "All right, continue." Maya continued, explaining the details, the ones he had glossed over, the ones he had underestimated, the ones he didn't even realize mattered. She wasn't trying to make him feel small. She was simply doing her job, and doing it well. But the more she spoke, the more the investor's posture changed. He no longer lounged in his chair. He leaned forward now, elbows on the table, phone forgotten. His eyes moved between her documents and her face, trying to follow every point she made. He didn't interrupt this time. Not once. When she finished, the room was quiet once again. The executives sat still, letting the moment settle. Maya closed the folder gently, her expression still calm. The investor studied her for a long second. Something unspoken passed across his face, curiosity, maybe a hint of embarrassment. But he said nothing yet. Not until he knew who she really was. Not until the truth finally hit him. And though he didn't know it yet, this meeting, the one he thought he controlled, was about to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. The room felt heavier now, almost as if the air itself had changed. The investor, who had walked in so loudly and full of pride, now sat quietly, trying to understand everything he had just heard. His eyes were fixed on the papers in front of him, but his mind was clearly somewhere else. Replaying the details Maya had just explained, the executives sat a little straighter too. It was subtle, but they all felt it, the shift in control, the change in direction. They had expected this moment, though maybe not so soon. They watched the investor carefully, waiting to see how he would respond, hoping he would finally slow down enough to understand the seriousness of the project. Maya sat calmly, her hands gently resting on her folder. She looked peaceful, almost detached, yet completely aware of everything happening around her. She didn't feel triumphant or proud. This wasn't a competition to her. She only hoped the investor would start taking the project seriously. Too much work, too many people, and too many plans depended on it. For a few seconds, no one said anything. The investor lifted his head slowly, his face showing a mix of confusion and curiosity. It was the first time since he entered the room that he looked unsure. "So, you know all of this?" he asked, his tone softer than before. "Yes," Maya replied, in the same calm voice. "I've been working on the project since the beginning." He blinked, and for a moment it seemed like he had run out of words. He tapped lightly on the table, a habit he seemed to have when he didn't know what to say next. "All right," he finally muttered. "Continue, then." But before Maya could answer, one of the executives cleared his throat. "Actually," he said, "we should move on to the budget breakdown and risk assessment next. Maya has prepared all of that as well." The investor nodded slowly, not in his usual confident way, but in a thoughtful, almost humbled manner. He gestured with his hand. "Go ahead." Maya opened another folder, carefully turning the pages. Her voice remained steady, simple, and direct. She explained the cost of materials, the shifting market prices, and the consequences of rushing the construction. She talked about community impact, transportation routes, and the realistic timeline for the project. What surprised the investor most wasn't just the information itself, it was how she explained it. She didn't speak like someone trying to impress him or outsmart him. She spoke like someone who cared about the project, someone who understood every piece of it, someone who knew what problems could appear months before they happened. "Wait," interrupted again, but this time his tone held no sarcasm. "How did you figure out the transportation issue? I thought that wasn't confirmed yet." "It wasn't," Maya admitted. "So I met with the local transportation team myself last month. They gave me access to the proposed route map and the traffic study. It helped make the new timeline more accurate." The investor stared at her, stunned. "You met them yourself?" "Yes," she said simply. He sat back, rubbing his chin. For the first time, he seemed genuinely impressed. It wasn't the loud kind of admiration he usually showed when he talked about himself. It was quiet, reluctant, and real. The executives exchanged another glance. They looked relieved. They had been waiting for him to see the truth, not because they wanted to teach him a lesson, but because they needed him to understand the depth of the work behind the deal. If he continued to dismiss everything, the project would fail before it even started. Maya turned the next page. Her explanation continued, and slowly the investor's entire posture changed. He leaned forward, listening closely. He no longer checked his phone. He no longer made jokes. He no longer looked bored. Instead, he began asking questions, real questions. "How did you calculate these delays? What's the backup plan if the suppliers pull out? Why did you lower the initial profit estimate?" Maya answered every one of them with calm assurance. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She didn't talk down to him. She simply explained the facts and the reasons behind every decision she had made. At one point, he shook his head slowly. "I didn't know any of this was happening behind the scenes. That's why I wrote detailed reports," she said gently. "They're all included in the main files." He swallowed hard. "I may have skimmed those." One of the executives almost smiled, but he quickly straightened his face. Maya didn't smile either, but her expression softened just a little. "It's all right. That's why we're discussing it now." The investor looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing her differently for the first time. His arrogance had faded. His impatience had quieted. He wasn't trying to take control anymore. He was trying to understand. The meeting continued, and now it felt more like a conversation rather than a battle of egos. The investor asked questions with genuine interest. Maya answered with patience. The executives added comments when needed, but more often they watched silently, grateful for the subtle transformation happening right before their eyes. Still, the mood in the room wasn't completely smooth. The investor occasionally slipped back into his old habits, interrupting too quickly or dismissing something too fast. But each time he did, Maya handled it with the same steady calmness. She didn't argue. She didn't confront him. She simply brought the conversation back to the facts. At one point, the investor leaned forward and asked, "So you're saying the land rights issue isn't as simple as I thought?" "That's correct," she replied. "There are multiple parties involved and the approval might take longer." He frowned. "And if we push, then we take a risk," she said. "A big one." He let out a slow breath. "I see." There was a pause. A real one this time. Not the awkward type, but the thoughtful kind. The executives noticed it immediately. Something was finally sinking in. The investor stood up suddenly, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. His reflection in the glass looked smaller, quieter, almost humbled. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at the cars moving far below and the buildings shining under the afternoon sun. After a few seconds, he asked without turning around, "How long did you say you've been working on this project?" 8 months, Maya replied. "Almost 9, he nodded slowly. "And you handled all the research?" "Yes." "All the planning?" "Yes." "And all the risk assessments?" "Yes." He turned around then, his expression more serious than anything the executives had seen from him before. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked quietly. The executives shifted uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat, but didn't speak. Another adjusted his glasses. No one knew how to answer that politely. Maya finally spoke. "We did tell you," she said gently. "It was in the reports." The investor blinked again, embarrassed. "Right, the reports. I skimmed." He sighed. "I understand." He walked back to the table, but he didn't sit down right away. He looked at Maya again, studying her carefully, not with arrogance. Not with impatience, but with respect. He was only just starting to realize she deserved. "You're not an assistant, are you?" he said quietly. The executives froze. Maya didn't answer. Not yet. She simply folded her hands and waited. The investor nodded to himself, as if confirming something in his own mind. "I knew something was off. No assistant talks like that. No assistant knows that much." He let out a breath. "So who are you really?" The room grew silent. The executives looked at Maya, waiting for her to speak, but she didn't. Not yet. She wasn't hiding anything. She simply believed that every answer had its moment. And this, clearly, was not the moment. "Instead," she said softly, "we can discuss that after we finish reviewing the risk mitigation plan." The investor looked at her for a long second, torn between frustration and admiration. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's continue." And so they did. The meeting moved forward, deeper into the details. The investor listened, truly listened, for the first time. The executives felt hopeful. Maya remained steady, guiding the conversation with ease. But even though the investor stayed calm on the outside, his mind was growing louder with each passing minute. Who was she? Why didn't he know about her? Why had he assumed she was just someone to fetch coffee? And most of all, how much more would he discover before this meeting ended? He didn't know it yet. But the truth waiting for him would change everything. He thought he knew about this project, about the quiet woman he had underestimated. The meeting room had grown strangely quiet, almost too quiet for such an important negotiation. It was the kind of silence that made even small sounds seem louder, the clicking of a pen, the soft rustle of papers, the hum of the air conditioning in the ceiling. Everyone could feel something shifting beneath the surface, even if no one said it out loud. Maya felt it too. She could sense the investor's eyes on her more often now. Before, he barely looked at her at all. Now, every time she turned a page, every time she spoke, every time she paused, he watched her like he was studying hurt, trying to understand who she really was. Still, she didn't let it distract her. She kept her focus steady, her tone calm, and her explanations clear. She wasn't doing this for attention. She wasn't doing it to prove him wrong. She was doing it because the project mattered, and because the people depending on it deserved someone who cared. One of the executives noticed the investor's growing interest and quietly nudged another under the table. They exchanged a small, knowing look. None of them dared to smile, but they felt a subtle satisfaction. They had been waiting for him to reach this point of realization. Maya continued explaining the risk mitigation plan. She pointed out which areas could be strengthened, where costs might rise unexpectedly, and what adjustments would protect the investment. "Hold on," the investor said suddenly, leaning forward again. "You said something about a supplier issue earlier. Explain that part again." She nodded and pulled out another set of papers. "There's a chance the main supplier might experience shortages next quarter. Their production rates have dropped by 12% in the last 4 months. If that continues, we'll need a backup option." The investor frowned. "How do you know their production dropped?" I visited the site myself, she said simply. Twice. That stunned him so much he stopped blinking for a moment. You visited the supplier? In person? Yes. I wanted to see their operations up close. It helps avoid surprises later. He sat back in his chair, eyebrows raised. Most people don't do that. I know, she replied gently. But I prefer to rely on facts, not assumptions. One of the executives gave a small nod of agreement. Another took a quiet sip of water. Hiding a smile behind the glass, the investor let out a long breath, this time not out of frustration, but because he was slowly beginning to recognize something he had never noticed before. Someone in the room cared more about this project than he did, and that someone wasn't him. He rubbed his forehead, almost embarrassed. You've done more work than I realized. Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. The meeting went on. Charts were shown. Documents changed hands. The details grew deeper, more technical, more complex. Yet the investor never looked away from Maya as she explained each part. He was listening now out of politeness, but out of genuine need. He needed her, and he knew it. After another hour of discussion, the investor stopped the conversation with a raised hand. Can we pause for a moment? He asked quietly. Everyone froze. He stood up slowly, walked toward the window again, and stared out at the city. The sunlight reflected off the skyscrapers, creating bright patches of gold that danced across the glass. For a while, he didn't speak. The executives waited. Maya waited. All of them could feel that whatever he was thinking was important. Finally, he turned around, his face more serious than ever. Something's been bothering me, he said. We've been talking for almost 3 hours now, and... He hesitated. I still don't know your position. Maya kept her expression neutral. My position? Yes, he said, taking a slow step closer. Your title, your role, where you stand in all of this. He gestured toward the papers spread across the table. Because from what I've seen, you're not the assistant. Not even close. Everyone felt the weight of his words. The executives looked at one another. They weren't surprised, he finally asked, but they didn't expect him to sound so unsure, almost nervous. Maya remained silent. Letting him speak, the investor pulled out his chair and sat down again, but this time he didn't lean back. He sat upright, elbows on the table, truly engaged. You know this project better than anyone here. You've done the research, the planning, the travel, the coordination. You're the one explaining everything. You're the one answering every question. He paused. So who are you really? The executives shifted again. One of them looked at Maya carefully, was waiting to see what she would say. She could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't rush. She took a slow breath, her voice steady and calm. I'll explain soon, she said softly. But let's finish reviewing the final phase first. It will make more sense afterward. The investor looked confused but nodded. All right, if that's what you want. And just like that, the meeting resumed. Maya opened another folder, revealing the final phase of the plan, the part that would tie everything together. She explained the last steps of the timeline, the projected completion window, the ways to prevent delays. The investor listened closely, nodding occasionally. His mind was racing, not with the usual impatience or pride, but with curiosity. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was sitting in front of someone far more important than he first believed. At one point, he whispered almost to himself, "Why didn't I know about her?" One of the executives quietly replied, "You didn't ask." The investor looked at him sharply, then slowly lowered his gaze. It was a humbling moment, one he wasn't used to experiencing. As Maya continued speaking, the investor studied her again, not the way he did earlier, but in a way that carried genuine respect. He watched how she held herself, how she explained everything with patience, how she didn't need to raise her voice or show off. She just worked with quiet confidence, letting her knowledge speak for her. The meeting moved into the part of the plan that involved coordinating with local leaders. Maya explained the conversations she had with community members and why their input mattered. You met them too? The investor asked. Yes, she answered. They shared concerns that weren't included in the early reports. and you included them. Of course. The investor leaned back slightly, thinking, most people in your position wouldn't bother. She looked at him calmly. I don't think we should build something without listening to the people who live there. Her words hit him harder than she expected. Something in his face softened. His shoulders lowered. His expression changed, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, thoughtful way, as if a new sense of awareness had settled in. For the first time, the investor didn't feel bigger than the room. He didn't feel like the most important person at the table. Instead, he felt small. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him realize he had been looking at things the wrong way. He had walked in thinking the project revolved around him. Now he was starting to understand that the project existed because of the people who had put in the real work. People like Maya. The executives could see the change happening in him. One of them folded his arms. Another quietly sat back, observing the moment. They knew the truth was coming, and soon he would know it too. Maya finished the final explanation, closed her folder, and placed her hands gently on top of it. That covers the whole structure of the project, she said. Everything else depends on your decision. The investor didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let out a slow breath, looking down at the table. Then he looked up again, straight at Maya. I think it's time you tell me your real role, he said quietly. This time, she didn't look away. She didn't pause. She didn't avoid the question. She met his gaze directly, her voice calm and steady. I will, she said softly. In just a moment. The investor frowned in confusion, but before he could say anything, one of the executives spoke up. There's one more thing you need to understand first, he said. The investor turned to him, puzzled. What do you mean? The executive leaned forward slightly. Before Maya explains her role, you need to know how this entire project started. The investor raised an eyebrow. Started. Maya remained quiet, her expression unreadable. Yes, the executive continued. Because once you understand that, everything else, including her role, will make perfect sense. The investor stared at them, torn between curiosity and nervousness. All right, he said slowly. Tell me. And with that, the truth that had been quietly waiting in the background began to move closer, piece by piece, until soon. There would be no hiding it anymore. The day after the meeting felt strangely calm for her, even though she knew the storm was far from over. People around the building walked with more purpose than usual, as if everyone had just realized something important had been happening behind the scenes. She moved through the halls quietly, not wanting to draw attention, but also not hiding. She simply wanted to continue doing her work the way she always had. She sat at her desk, opening her laptop and reading through the stack of messages she had received overnight. Some were from team members asking for updates. Some were from partners who appreciated the clarity she had brought to the previous day's meeting. A few were from people she had barely spoken to before, suddenly wanting to connect or collaborate. She smiled a little while reading those. It was always the same. People noticed when you had value, but only after someone else pointed it out. Still, she did not let it change her. She stayed focused on the project, its numbers, its planning, and the people depending on her. She believed that real power didn't need loud announcements. Real power showed through actions, results, calm decisions. Later that morning, she received a message from the head office asking her to stop by the main conference room when she was free. There was no explanation, no agenda, nothing to suggest what they wanted. She paused for a moment and then decided to go right away. She didn't want unnecessary anxiety hanging over her head. When she reached the room, the door was slightly open. She could hear voices inside, low, controlled, almost too polite. She recognized one of them immediately. It was the wealthy investor who had dismissed her the previous day. His tone sounded different, now as confident. More cautious, but she couldn't hear what he was saying clearly. She knocked lightly and stepped in when she heard someone say, "Come in." The room was full. A few department heads, a couple of senior advisors, and the investor himself sat around the long table. Their eyes turned toward her as she entered. For a second, she felt like she had stepped onto a stage she never asked for. But she kept her body calm and her expression neutral. "Thank you for coming," one of the senior advisors said. She nodded and took a seat. The advisor folded his hands on the table and leaned slightly forward. We've been discussing the direction of the project and how yesterday's meeting changed things. We believe it's time to reconsider certain assumptions. The investor shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at her before quickly looking away. His confidence from the day before had evaporated. He looked like someone who had walked into a room expecting to lead, only to realize he wasn't the one steering anymore. We'd like to hear more from you, the advisor continued, specifically about the long-term strategy and the possibilities you see that the rest of us may not have considered yet. She took a quiet breath. She was used to conversations like this, but she also understood the delicate nature of the moment. This wasn't just about strategy. It was about people rethinking their perception of her. Before she began, she looked briefly at the investor. Not out of pride or a desire to embarrass him, but because she wanted him to see that she wasn't holding any resentment. She wasn't there to make a point. She was there to do her work. She spoke clearly, explaining how the project could grow beyond what they initially expected, how the community would respond to certain changes, and how small adjustments in approach could save them time, money, and effort. She didn't speak quickly or loudly. She simply laid out the facts as she understood them, facts she had gathered through months of careful study and quiet analysis. As she spoke, the room softened. People leaned forward, taking notes, nodding slowly. Even the investor listened differently this time. He didn't interrupt. He didn't question. He absorbed every word as if he were hearing her for the first time. When she finished, there was a small silence. It wasn't awkward. It was thoughtful. One of the department heads finally cleared his throat. "I think we underestimated the depth of your understanding," he said. "Your perspective is not only valuable, it's necessary if we're going to move forward without stumbling." The investor shifted again, and this time he looked directly at her. For the first time since she had known him, he didn't have that polished, untouchable expression on his face. He looked human, someone who had been caught in a moment of his own misunderstanding. "If I may," he began quietly, "I'd like to say something." Everyone turned toward him. "I made a mistake yesterday," he continued. "A large one. I judged without knowing, spoke without listening, and acted without respect. I didn't understand who you were or what you did for this project, and I'm sorry." The room stayed still. Apologies in such environments were rare, especially from people of his status, but she appreciated the honesty in his tone. It didn't feel forced. It felt sincere. She nodded gently. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." The advisor stepped in again. "Going forward, we'd like you to take a more active role in leading the decision-making for the next phase. You clearly have the insight we need." She felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest, not excitement, but a quiet sense of validation. She had worked hard, stayed steady, and never pushed herself into the spotlight. Yet here she was, being recognized in a room full of people who once overlooked her. "I'd be happy to help however I can," she said simply. The meeting continued for another hour. They discussed timelines, responsibilities, and upcoming challenges. Every time someone asked for input, they turned to her first. She didn't dominate the conversation, but she guided it when necessary. Her calmness settled the room. Her confidence, soft but unmistakable, lifted it. When the meeting ended, people gathered their notes and stood up to leave. Several came to her individually, thanking her or expressing excitement about working more closely with her. She responded kindly, not letting the sudden attention change her behavior. The investor lingered behind as the others left. When the room was nearly empty, he approached her slowly. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her. "I truly am sorry. I hope you won't let yesterday define the way you see me." She thought for a moment, then offered a small, sincere smile. "People make mistakes," she said. "What matters is whether they learn from them." He nodded, relief visible on his face. "I did learn. More than you know." They walked out of the room, not as opponents, and not exactly as allies yet, but with a sense that something had shifted. A new understanding had formed a cleaner, more respectful foundation. As she stepped back into the hallway, she felt lighter. Not because she had been praised, not because she had been apologized to, but because she had proven something important without, for needing to raise her voice or fight for attention. She had shown who she truly was. And now, finally, others could see it too. What she didn't know yet was that the most important moment was still waiting ahead. Her influence, her insight, and her quiet strength were about to change more than just a project. They were about to reshape someone's entire understanding of leadership and of the kind of person who truly holds power behind the scenes. The morning of the final presentation arrived with a kind of quiet tension that hung in the air like early fog. She woke up earlier than usual, not because she was nervous, but because she wanted time to think. She made tea, sat by the window, and watched the slow movement of traffic far below. The world outside was restless, but inside her apartment, everything felt still. She replayed the events of the past week in her mind. The first meeting where she had been dismissed as if her presence barely mattered. The moment the truth came out, the apology, and the sudden shift of respect that followed. She wasn't someone who needed praise, but she did value honesty. What she had seen in the investor's face the day before had been honest. He had learned something, and she hoped it would stay with him. She arrived at the office earlier than everyone else. The building felt different in the morning. Without the constant sound of phones, distant conversations, and footsteps, the hallways seemed to echo softly. She walked to the main conference room, switched on the lights, and placed her notes on the table. She didn't like crowds. She didn't like noise. She didn't like being the center of attention. But she did like the pieces of information that fit together. The challenges that forced her to think, and the way a small detail could change everything. She enjoyed solving problems that others overlooked. The final presentation wasn't just about the project. It was about showing the full picture, the roadmap, the risks, the opportunities, and the long-term stability. People from the company and people from the investors' team would all be watching. Everyone wanted to understand the direction clearly as she reviewed her notes one last time. The door opened, and a few early team members walked in. They smiled at her, and she smiled back. They had grown more comfortable with her presence over the past few days. Some had even begun asking for her advice outside of meetings. She appreciated that, even if she didn't show it openly. Not long after, the investor entered the room. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of respect that he hadn't been capable of just days earlier. She returned the nod politely. There was no tension between them now, just understanding. One by one, the seats filled. The room grew warm with quiet conversations and the soft tapping of keyboards. The advisor eventually called the meeting to order, and everyone took their seats. The advisor began with a short introduction, speaking about the importance of clarity and the long-term goals of the project. He talked about the need for stable leadership and the value of insight based on actual research rather than assumptions. Then he gestured toward her. We'll begin with the full breakdown from the person who understands this project better than anyone else. She stood up slowly, walked to the front of the room, and took a calm breath before she started. She didn't raise her voice or try to impress anyone. She just explained things clearly. She talked about the foundation of the project. It's how the numbers aligned with the community's needs, and why certain decisions were necessary. She walked them through the long-term plan step by step, showing the parts that looked simple from the outside, but required deep understanding to manage well. She described the risks. She explained how each risk could be handled and why the team was prepared for them. She pointed out areas where the investors' initial assumptions had been off, not with judgment, but with gentle clarity. As she spoke, the room grew quieter. People were listening closely, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. The small details she shared, the connections she made, the calm way she worked through each challenge, all painted a picture of someone who truly understood her field. When she finished the first part of the presentation, she opened the floor for questions. The first few were simple, mostly clarifications. She answered them easily. Then came a complicated question from one of the investor's advisors. He asked about a potential conflict involving timing, budget, and community response, something most people would struggle to untangle. But she didn't hesitate. She explained the problem using clear steps, showing how the issue wasn't as tangled as it seemed if you looked at it from the right angle. She offered possible solutions and calmly explained the benefits of each. By the time she finished, the advisor who had asked the question nodded slowly. Impressed, the investor watched her closely the entire time. There was no doubt in his expression now, no shadow of the man who once saw her as unimportant. He looked thoughtful, humbled, even grateful. After nearly 2 hours, the presentation wrapped up. The advisor thanked her. People began gathering their things and standing. Some went straight to her to offer compliments or ask follow-up questions. She answered politely, though she felt a little overwhelmed by the attention. When the room was almost empty, the investor approached her again, but this time with a different posture. He seemed more open, more grounded. "I want to thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for today, but for everything you've done this week." She didn't know what to say at first. She simply nodded. "I was wrong about you," he continued. "I judged you by the surface. I thought I understood what mattered, but I didn't. You've shown me how mistaken I was." She looked at him calmly. "What matters is that you understand now." He let out a soft breath, like someone letting go of a long-held worry. "I do, and I won't forget it." There was sincerity in his voice against something rare from someone in his position. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "You changed the direction of this project, and you changed something in me too. I hope you know that your work, your insight, it's powerful. More powerful than you realize." She didn't respond right away. She didn't like taking praise too directly, but she appreciated the honesty. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm glad the project is on the right path now." He smiled, a softer one than before. "It is, because of you." The room finally emptied, leaving only her and the soft hum of the lights. She gathered her things slowly, giving herself a moment to breathe. The tension of the week melted away step by step. As she walked out of the building, the afternoon sunlight felt warm against her face. People outside continued with their busy lives, unaware of everything that had happened behind those glass walls. But she felt different. She felt seen, not because she had demanded it, but because she had earned it through patience, hard work, and quiet strength. She stepped onto the sidewalk, feeling lighter than she had in days. She didn't need applause or titles. She didn't need her name on a plaque. What mattered was knowing she had done what she always tried to do: work with integrity, stay true to herself, and let her actions speak for her. What she didn't realize was that her influence would continue long after the project ended. People would remember the way she carried herself with calm, with grace, with steady confidence. And somewhere inside the investor who once belittled her role, a deeper understanding would take root that true power isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, thoughtful, steady. Sometimes the person who seems invisible is the one holding everything together, and sometimes the person others overlook ends up changing the direction of an entire dayland, the hearts of the people involved.